Let's see, going to your chat windows.
I think everything else is closed. All righty. 11 June, 5-ish. This and that. Interesting day today. Those who haven't heard, 3 counts. Guilty. Hunter Biden. Unfortunately, the GOP is not happy that, despite the fact that they won, essentially, there's certainly the possibility that Hunter Biden will not go to jail, first-time offender, etc. The judge wrote a set of instructions that was ensured, at least that's what the appearance was. There's actually one juror who was unhappy with the way the judge's instructions were written. And but anyway, Hunter Biden might not spend any time in jail, but of course he will be a felon, just like what's his name, who we can spin it as he has 10 times as many felony counts as Hunter Biden. So anyway, so that's the news today. There's more, the usual with other things, Israel, Gaza, etc. So that's kind of the news at the front end. What we want to do today is continue on. We're up to the summary by Simon Clarke of all 3 volumes of Capital, which would normally be something like 3,000 pages. So it's winnowed down to a summary of 76 pages. So that's that may be actually a lot for some folks, but it's really not that much. And as I've said before, it's important to sort of look at different ways in which capital is being assessed, summarized, or concluded, mainly because, there are a bunch of different positions. Some insist on certain kinds of, doctrine or certain ideas that aren't quite clear. Recalling, of course, that I was attacking the idea of congealed labor. It really makes very little sense. So I tend not to use it except in a pejorative way. Just one simple example. So we'll get to chapter 2 in a second. The way I set this one up is I included a section on the Grundrisse because, as I mentioned yesterday, the Grundrisse fits kind of in between. It's kind of a preliminary to Capital. It's foundational because Grundrisse means foundation. But it's left behind at some moment and only rediscovered in the 20th century to sort of work through some of these same issues about what Marx's humanism looked like. And people just looking for Dead Sea Scrolls here and there. I've included David Harvey's thing on the Grundrisse, which he did only a year or so ago. A copy of the companion to the Grundrisse is available in the Discord. And there is a guide that is done by Chris Arthur. Chris Arthur actually has some really interesting ideas that need to be sort of considered. Andy Higginbottom does refer to Arthur occasionally in his own presentations on Capital. So you sort of, I think you can get this idea that it's not really about objects, but really about relationships or connections, or you could refer to them as nodes or a kind of network relations. The way in which we talk about capitalists is that we, they don't do things necessarily by themselves. It's a lot of it is trying to convince other people to spend their money, invest their capital. And I mentioned yesterday the idea of using share capital. It's a very specific accounting version of capital that is not as liquid and et cetera. It has rules, and that if we were going to move towards a kind of socialism, would be to seize certain things like share capital in order to simply nationalize certain assets. You'd automatically control a certain percentage of the total set of amount of capital of a corporation. Now, of course, that suggests that a kind of authoritarian move, and some of us aren't, might not subscribe to that idea, but I think there are certain moments at which, if we're dealing with summers of triple-digit weather and et cetera, I think we begin to see that, well, maybe you should, make public utilities really public utilities. So it's a system of relationships, social relations. Money is therefore the most developed form in which the social relations of commodity exchange appear. Money is itself a form of social relation. In other words, it facilitates exchange. It is a store of value, but really transitory and relies on a lot of other things, and is problematic because of trying to universalize it, that is, use it in an international context or against currency or whatever. So there are issues. Commodities as object of use or goods are corporeally different things. Their reality as value forms, on the other hand, their unity. This unity does not arise out of nature, but out of society. And that's that specific difference. Now, we can refer to natural capital, and that does happen. Can refer to human capital too. But this simple dichotomy is fairly important. The common social substance, which merely manifests itself differently in different use values, is labor. And that's just oversimplifying this issue, because it's not labor per se, but of course labor power. Or if you want to look at it a different way, it's certain expectations or the potentiality of the use of labor, noting that all of Marx's activity is to try to look for ways in which you can apply more universal values, which requires a certain more abstract view or abstract construction, social construction of value. Now, this is difficult for some people because they're kind of tied up in this physical object stuff. So you need to imagine that it's not simply about objects, but it's about materiality, which is not quite the same thing. And the way in which you can think about that is the idea of the material that is in knowledge, that knowledge is a kind of material thing. That on the one hand, you have books, on the other hand, you have something else that's in your brain that you think about that may not necessarily be quite as manifest. And you can see that you can build entire theories on this, right? That, well, the only execution of pure thought is, of course, in certain types of speech that, otherwise no one knows what you're thinking about, right? And in fact, you can do it obliquely. You don't have to say something directly. It's coded in a very complex way in some ways. In other ways, it can be quite simple. Yelling fire in a theater, etc. In a country where fire is not the standard word for flames, or something that will require a fire brigade, if you yell fire, that would have no effect in a theater. This interpretation of the theory of value as a technical economic theory is important because it underlies most of the critiques of Marx's theory of value. Marx's theory of value as a labor theory has a tremendous criticism. And I think it's, you sort of need to work through it yourself, that is that, there's some kind of energy transfers occurring, some sort of physiological musculature is in operation. Neurons are firing. That you need to get this sense of, well, what kind of labor is that? It's not necessarily work. It's perhaps the potential for work. That is, a command, for example, is a very specific kind of act, and it has rhetorical force and blah, blah, blah. The idea is, of course, that it's just an utterance in that particular sense. And yet it underlies, so much culture. Chapter 2. This chapter begins the transition from the commodity to capital by developing Marx's understanding of money. Remember, as I said before, money is sort of underdeveloped in the Marxian context only because, he didn't leave it out, but things were complicated enough without getting into a kind of theory of money. But it is important, and people in the post-World War II period have worked on this money problem. It is the opening, of course, for modern monetary theory, in the sense that, certain aspects of the idea of what money is, or what value it represents, or how it operates as a kind of commodity itself, is important to, reconsider. We're sort of just used to this idea of cash, that money has these certain instrumental elements and currency differences and rates of interest and other kinds of things. And we sort of assume that it has its sort of, normative. Well, it really isn't. It's a little more complicated than that. And I mean, in reality, it's more complicated than that. That's how people get away with money laundering and all these other things, because certain elements of the monetary system are not fully regulated or controlled, and you have entire bodies of culture that operate on cash. They don't operate on anything other than cash, or they operate on certain rules that aren't quite spelled out, which can always get you into trouble if you're, sort of in with the mob and the VIG and blah, blah, blah. Chapter 2 starts with a summary of the basic argument of Chapter 1. We cannot understand the commodity without looking at the social relations that lie behind it. That's always a problematic metaphor. That something is always behind something or underneath something. Just don't worry about that. There is this kind of, layering or veil-like element, and you just have to be sort of sensitive to that. Commodities are things, and therefore lack the power to resist man. Well, that's sort of one way of looking at it. Commodities can only exchange with one another if their owners relate to one another through the exchange of commodities. Thus, exchange presupposes that they recognize each other as owners of private property. Now, this is, this issue of ownership is always a problem. It continues to this day, people's right to a certain kind of property or whatever. It might seem that this implies that exchange presupposes the development of a legal system embodying private property, i.e., that economic developments presuppose legal developments. In other words, what is this relation? It is the administrative state, or simply the construction of ownership rights or whatever. How is that constructed relative to the actual piece of nature itself, if you're talking about land? And that's problematic, right? The idea of claim jumping, contestable boundaries or barriers, all kinds of other wacky little ideas, some of which can involve religion. Some people think they have a religious right to something, and they can't prove it, but it's sort of amusing that they try. And of course, the mayhem occurs. However, Marx immediately emphasizes that this juridical relation mirrors the economic relation, that its content is determined by the economic relation. This question of mirroring and determining is also a little more flexible. How this could be becomes clear in the summary account of the development of exchange that makes up the bulk of this chapter, Chapter 2. It is only when members of society become independent producers that both commodity exchange and the concept of private property can develop. Thus, Marx is not arguing that the legal system reflects the economic system of commodity exchange. Rather, Marx is arguing that both the legal system, that is mutual recognition by commodity owners of each other as owners of private property. So it's a mutuality thing. I mean, who else is going to establish that authority? And the more narrow economic relation of exchange are forms of expression of the fundamental social relation, which is that between social subjects who have become independent producers. Now, that seems like a lot of, sort of gibberish, but the reality is this idea that you only know property from in a social context, and you always know that it is, your stuff is not, has this problem of not being other people's stuff. And this idea of things that are not yours is a kind of interesting way, there are interesting ways in which you sort of define them. The bulk of chapter 2 discusses the historical development of the commodity and of commodity relations as an isolated exchange of use values. Marx argues exchange is an individual process. On the other hand, once the process of exchange becomes general, commodity owners seek not isolated exchanges, but rather seek to exchange their products for anything and everything they need. In other words, exchange becomes a general social process. It just makes less sense if you have some sort of private language about what numbers mean or what quantity means, particularly if you're exchanging goods or trading goods over distances. Every commodity owner wants his own commodity to be universally acceptable in exchange, but it is impossible for every commodity to have this status. And you try to do that with the money, right? But yet, you have people shaving metal off of the coins. And so it's you can't guarantee that, and it becomes problematic for all the usual reasons. What's the standard, and do you have standardized weights and measures, et cetera, et cetera? Hence, until a universal equivalent emerges, exchange as a general social process is impossible. And so exchange can only be a series of individual exchange relations of use values and not the exchange of fully fledged commodities. So this is, the barter system is kind of the default. You'll have this kind of thing and you make certain decisions about it, but it's not always quite there. And then you have some slack built into it, the little penny dish at the convenience store. The universal equivalent emerges, Marx argues, out of the development of exchange itself, as a particular commodity is fixed upon to serve as a universal equivalent. And so this, there is this search for universals. I mean, we have the same problem in measures, right? They're similar in weights. Yes, there is a standard yard or meter somewhere. And I mean, it's just the meter itself, is this metal thing that sits somewhere, at least in the British context. Marx emphasizes that this universal equivalent is such because it is itself a commodity that has value, and so can serve to express the value of other commodities. Thus, money is not a mere symbol which acquires its value through exchange. So there is a kind of, foundational element, some fixity to it, let alone a thing whose value is inherent in its physical properties. This is that same problem with, metals. Money is a commodity which has a value like any other commodity. This is Marx's point, is that you establish through exchange the values of things like of commodities. That is, it's always about the process of exchanging or practices of exchange. In becoming the universal equivalent, that commodity serves to express the universal social character of the relations between commodity owners. It marks the transition from exchange as a discrete relation between private individuals to exchange as an expression of social relations between interdependent individuals. And that's a subtle difference, but this interdependence is actually kind of important. There's a certain communication, in other words, that goes on. Thus, the fetishism of money corresponds closely to that of commodities. That is, the kind of invested meaning you have of it. The fact that you may invest meaning on having enough in your damn pocket, etc. This chapter 3 looks at money in more detail. You can skip most of it if you're pressed for time. A lot of the argument being rather technical. The chapter is concerned primarily with the various functions of money and with the different features attached to each. Now, it's important to Marx to put some quantitative elements, as we mentioned, as Clarke mentions earlier, that in the front end chapter, you're sort of front loading this because somebody's going to ask the damn question about money. So the main theme of chapter 3 develops the argument of the first two chapters that money is the product of exchange, developing in accordance with the needs of exchange. Thus, it is not money that creates exchange, nor the quantity of money that determines prices. That's really the most important point. Money doesn't necessarily create exchange. Exchange just simply occurs. You know, people just barter, dicker, or whatever, fight with each other. And the quantity of money is not always about what constitutes prices. Prices are not, prices can be identical to money. But it is important to see that it's not always about price that establishes ultimately that big V value. Thus, the fetishism of money is a development of the fetishism of commodities, which precedes money. I mean, people just, whatever, stuff's magical, right? Little crosses or other things, fetish objects that so fetishism is not necessarily about money. It's about just stuff. Note that until the section on coin or coinage, Marx is dealing with commodity money, that is, money based on gold. Now, everyone would like to think this is the basic sort of thing, and returning to it, killing off the Fed, bringing back metal, blah, blah, blah. Incredibly problematic when you consider that gold is not, has this other kind of problem, that it's not available universally, and there's a lot of weird hoarding and accounting that comes with gold, and Nazi gold, for example. Marx is dealing with commodity money, i.e., money based on gold. Since his day, domestic but not international monetary systems have largely broken the link with gold. Note, of course, that international monetary systems have used gold because in some ways it helps tie some elements of trade together. It's simply because it's a category and it's kind of stable. The fact is we don't do a lot of exchange in it, but it does have a relationship to how you set the larger international value of stuff. Now, it's not the only thing, but it is just one element. And so don't get too crazy about saying, well, we should all just use some sort of metal. I think we could, but it's just ugly. And we have all these other forms, commodity forms, that make it much more complicated, as we have noted with fungible tokens and blah, blah, blah. Recognition of this modifies some of Marx's arguments, and that's kind of what the 20th and 21st century have given to this. All right. So for further reading, see Dobrunov's Marx on Money. It's really the first of a bunch of books of Marx on money. It's kind of important. This chapter of Capital is a less detailed version of the chapter on money in the contribution to the critique of political economy. Now, note that because, this question of dealing with money, Marx is a little ambivalent about. So the earlier thing, contribution to the critique, is, more worked out, but not continued on in the magnum opus, Capital. The first section of the chapter deals with money as the measure of value, the commodity in terms of which the value of other commodities is expressed. So there's a kind of relative relation. Although no money is actually present when the value of commodity is established, i.e., or e.g., a price label is attached to it, the price is not arbitrary. That's really important, for it is a relation between the labor embodied in the commodity and the labor embodied in gold. Now, the problem, of course, is that, digging up gold has a certain amount of labor built into it, but that's not really part of the price. It's the price of gold, or the value of gold, is essentially in its weight. So gold is not only the measure of value in this primitive sort of model, it is also, quote, a standard of price. The two must not be confused. Setting the standard of price is arbitrary, carried out by governments. Which say that, for example, 1 ounce of gold will be called 1 pound, which doesn't make a lot of sense relative to what an actual pound, how much a pound weighs. So that's a whole different question. The second section deals with money as a means of circulation. So we've looked at this kind of, the gold is sitting there. It has a certain kind of value or meaning or set of messages that it sort of gives off. But the second section is about circulating. And as we've talked about before, circulation is much more important. Some people don't like dealing with it because it's just more complicated. Stuff's been around, and it's usually about scale and blah, blah, blah. To analyze this, Marx returns to the formal analysis of exchange. You should read the first part of this section. Don't worry about the Hegelian language. Remember, this is a guide to reading the chapter, so you don't have to read every damn word, because sometimes, and with all due respect, Marx gets off on a tangent or doesn't quite complete the, sort of leave stuff out, and it gets screwed up in translation. So just relax. The main point is that in order to exchange one commodity for another, the value of the first commodity has to be realized in the form of money, and the money then realized in the use value of the second commodity. So in other words, we're looking at commodity exchange, but then you have to think about, well, is money altered at the same time? That's why it gets a little more complicated. The circulation of commodities has the form CMC. This is quite different from the simple exchange of use values, that is CC, right? Commodity, as opposed to commodity, money, commodity. The separation of purchase and sale introduces the possibility that the whole damn system can break down. A commercial crisis for every sale is conditional on previous purchases, since the buyer must have money. That's what's going on in Cuba right now. Within the circulation of commodities, money serves as a means of purchase. While commodities enter and leave circulation, money remains within circulation. In other words, you buy something, you take it home, or you transfer it to somebody, you give a gift or whatever. But the money's always there. I mean, the store of money or the volume of money is certainly different. Often referred to as the money supply. Thus, a certain given quantity of money is necessary and sufficient to maintain the circulation of commodities. And so Marx is talking about what the Fed worries about. And, it is why you get these major problems in economies where suddenly there's a panic. People want their money because, they don't trust the system to hold the value of the money commodity. And so, you get runs on banks and shit like that. So there's a long discussion of the quantity of money required for circulation. And there's a quantity theory of money, with all due respect, that is the kind of classical standard that is often used. And it has there's a kind of physics analogy about velocity and a bunch of other crazy things. So that there is a kind of core set of ideas here. This is not Marx making this up. Marx is really thinking about the larger system of things. You can skip this if you like. Marx argues that the quantity of money required depends on the level of prices, the number of transactions, this is part of the circulation issue, and the velocity of circulation of money. So velocity, meaning the speed of transactions or numbers of transactions. And this is kind of what goes on when you're looking at capitalist markets. Many economists have concluded from this, it is the quantity of money that determines the level of prices. This is the monetarist view fashionable today. And so, it's a kind of extrapolation from this gold question, and whether it really works or not is just simply, you're sort of taking it up one level in terms of value questions, but maybe that doesn't quite answer it. It does explain some things, but it's just it's an intermediate form in that sense. Marx argues that with commodity money, that is money, there are commodities, and then there's money, and money functions as a kind of commodity. It is a proxy. It is a more neutral or abstract proxy for the commodity. It is circulation that determines the movement of money, and not vice versa. It's not the other way around. It's the structural thing called circulation that is important. Now, the extrapolation from that is the level of prices that determines the quantity of money required. And this is always a problem, because in a real economy, the price level doesn't always determine the quantity of money available. People hoard, people do other crazy, stupid things. And so, yeah, you can generalize, but then there's a certain moment where it's not very viable, particularly if you're not thinking about other problems in capital. But this is before Marx explains capital. The third part of the second section you can also skip. Marx argues that token money can replace commodity money in the function of means of circulation. Token money is, for example, that there is a certain moment when paper money replaces metal money, and they exist side by side, and it's incredibly problematic for some people. And in some monetary systems or currency systems, you get this really bad set of issues that goes on. The Confederate States of America, of course, had this kind of problem that their money wasn't backed by anything. So you had all this kind of funny money, running around, and that wasn't worth anything, or wasn't easily transferable into American or Union money. In which function it represents commodity money symbolically. This is that symbolic question about, what counts as a Federal Reserve note or a silver certificates, and you can get into crazy thing on that. With token money, if too much money is issued, the currency will be devalued and the price will rise. So that's where it gets kind of ugly, and there are stories about this. In the third section, Marx turns to those forms of money in which gold serves as money, neither in ideal form as a measure of value, nor in symbolic form when token money, like, gold certificates, serves as a means of circulation, but in the forms of the hoard and of means of payment. That is, people are just holding on. It's Scrooge McDuck in the money bin. That, you don't trust anybody. So, screw you all. I'm going to, pile up all my little gold doubloons in a treasure chest. In these forms, money must have a substance which has an inherent value, as becomes clear in a crisis, for token money can easily be devalued. You can skip this section, but some of it makes very good reading. The main point of it is to conclude the discussion of the quantity of money required. Hoarding, that is, money binning, increases the required quantity. The separation of sale from payment and the rise of credit money. So credit money meaning, you have sort of weird promissory notes or other kinds of things, reduce the quantity required. So this just gets a little more crazy. Finally, money is also required for international transactions. And that's where, as I've said, mentioned before, and it's certainly worth considering, and it's problematic because it has all kinds of little ins and outs, and it has certain institutional issues as well, is international money flows. So that's how this outline looks. Needless to say, by this time, we're up to page 200 or 300 or whatever. Chapter 4. We now move from the rather technical discussion of money towards the heart of Marx's analysis, capital. And just as an aside, note, of course, that this follows a certain structure. Remember Harry Cleaver's version of this. where you sort of build on these ideas. You start with a commodity, you think about, use and exchange value, you think about abstract and concrete sort of relationships, which then become labor relationships. But then you get the next structural move, and that is to reformulate the commodity in a more abstract form, like money, et cetera, and it just builds from there. Like that of chapter 15.1, the exposition of chapters 4 to 6 is rather artificial, again, based on a number of implicit assumptions that focus attention on the fundamental social relations towards which Marx is working. Remember, it's always still about circulation, social relation, exchange, etc. That between labor and capital, ultimately it still boils down to this kind of interesting and problematic dichotomy of labor and capital. But they're nuanced. Both are very nuanced. In chapter 4, Marx is concerned to distinguish between money and capital, or rather between money as money and money as capital. Now that sounds like gibberish, but there's a difference between money used as a kind of a basic exchange element and money as something which you can sort of manipulate further. You can save and hoard it, just like we were looking at before, but also you can use it in a variety of other kinds of exchange elements, credit, debt, etc. The first form of capital, both historically and logically, is money. And so Marx distinguishes, as chapter 4, money is money and money is capital. First of all, by distinguishing the two forms of circulation. Remember, this is that key element. Circulation, motion, etc. The circulation of commodities, CMC, and the circulation of capital, MCM. This is without the prime. In each case, a purchase and a sale are combined, but in the first case, to exchange use values. In the second, to change money into money, or more rationally, money into more money. This is where the M prime comes from. Because it's changing, right? It's M plus delta M. That is, stuff. You want more money. It's that thing. The addition to the money laid out is called by Marx surplus value. This is where, this is how we try to calculate the question of both surplus labor and surplus value. They're not identical things, and it can be done simply, and it is done at a certain degree of scale. You sort of know the surplus kind of in relation to the much more larger systemic surplus. Marx here introduces the term Verwertung, that is translated in the Penguin edition as valorization. Now, we've talked about valorization before. It is this idea of getting more value for something. That's this M prime business. And as I tried to explain it in the crudest form possible, it is the way in which you could take waste or rubbish or some sort of secondary product, like in recycling, and create an entirely secondary market that creates more value. And that, in that same sense, it is being valorized. This unfamiliar term describes the process by which a value laid out returns to the starting point with an increase. This is the M prime. It is thus the motivation of the circulation of capital. You do it because you can, it reproduces itself. Other translators use the clearer but less accurate term self-expansion. So note that there are translation issues here. Then you've got to be sort of aware, sensitive to the idea that translation kind of can make you veer off a little bit if you take it too absolutely. This definition of capital leads straight on to the definition of the capitalist. Capital personified and endowed with consciousness and a will. That's a little kind of highfalutin, that capital can have a consciousness and a will. Here, Marx emphasizes strongly a central point of his argument. And this consciousness and will is about motives and part of the reasons to do all this stuff. And the capitalist is the constant accumulation of value. The aim of the capitalist is the constant accumulation of value, not the pursuit of use values. It's not because you want more axes. There's only a certain number of axes that you can use. It's that you have lots of extra axes that you can sell to other people and make more money. You know, I mean, you only need one axe or, you know, a chainsaw. But I mean, having three or four really kind of is futile. But if I have five chainsaws and I sell four of them because I only need one, it's a good deal. Thus, it is always money that is the end result of his activities. For the capitalist, the particular commodities he buys in the course of his activities function not as use values, but as particular embodiments of value. This embodiment question, this is where the congealing thing comes from. Embodiments of value that they have incorporated within themselves some idea about value. But it's not physical. It's a kind of idea of abstraction of putting a larger set of brackets or barrier or enclosures around, let's put it that way. Thus, the circulation of capital represents a constant movement of value from one form to another as capital takes the form now of commodities and now of money. So you start with the commodities, you move to a kind of more generalizable way that you can sort of trade them, use them in circulation, and you get to ultimately, some sort of commodity form, and ultimately commodity money is sort of at work. For the capitalist, the particular commodities he buys in the course of the activities function not as use values, but as particular embodiments of value. Thus, the circulation of capital represents a constant movement of value from one form to another as capital takes the form now of commodities and now of money. Value, therefore, becomes value in process, money in process, and as such, capital. So it's always about, capital is not it doesn't sort of sit there, although it's certainly clear that you can talk about the difference between fixed and variable capital and constant and variable capital in that particular context. But he does not initially define capital in its relation to labor, either as the social relation between capitalist or laborer, or the technical relation between machines and men that is often the everyday meaning of the term. We like using a kind of shorthand because we think of certain things that are less malleable, less plastic in that particular sense. And so there are these kind of hard goods that don't change a lot, and which you have to they weigh a lot. You're going to move them around and get electricity for them, et cetera, et cetera. So their use as is a little more complicated. You've got to set stuff up, blah blah blah. Hence, everything else is kind of more fluid, but it's not. They're just different elements in a larger constellation of things. Here, Marx is concerned with the general formula of capital. Remember, Marx, in all of these elements, is trying to think about generalizing the idea of this one set of relations. That is, you think about the relatively small scale, sort of tribal organization of primitive communism. It gets sort of a bigger scale when we move to feudalism. You have large estates, the king operating, you have lords and barons and the like. And there's just more people, so you get these kinds of relationships of how the baron organizes his relationship to the land and to the serfs. And we talked about that last time, about a certain obligation, demands of that you're unpaid labor, so that every Thursday you've got to go do work for the Lord, etc. Independent of its particular forms as merchant's capital, industrial capital, or interest-bearing capital, and this is, you don't get to this. Well, some is mentioned in volume 2. It is mentioned in volume 3. In its most general form, capital is defined as value that expands itself, and that's where you get this term, and it may sound complicated and in some ways ambiguous. That is self-valorizing value. which seems a little redundant too. And we don't yet know how value is able to do that, but it's the subject of the next two chapters. So if you look at the path that Marx is taking from chapter 1 through chapter 5, he's being very systematic. And I know that some people won't think that Marx is being systematic, but he really tries to do this in volume 1. It's just that getting into the particulars makes people angry and get in fights with each other about the terms, which can be easily avoidable. In this chapter, chapter 5, Marx investigates the possibility that surplus value may arise within circulation. Firstly, he argues that if commodities exchange at their value, which is the normal form of circulation, no surplus value can be created. And in fact, you might think, well, you get a clear exchange, and that maybe I'm not getting better at this, but at least stuff's moving. And so there is this a confusion of value with use value, and the source of many of the errors of previous economists is on the question of what's being circulated, what's being held, what is being manipulated relative to things like money. So it already is kind of complicated in the sense that you have several different layers, or as I refer to them, it's kind of nested set of values, certain ideas about expansion that are integrated, that are connected to each other. And so often it is simply the big V value that is confused with, in this first couple of chapters, with exchange, because some people will think, well, if you exchange, you're circulating stuff. Well, not really. I mean, what Marx is trying to do is say, well, exchange occurs and on a kind of one-to-one basis, but circulation doesn't really occur until you get like X number of exchanges. And so you always need to think about these things as certain abstractions, in the sense that they're kind of scale or scalar kind of elements. So he then argues that surplus value cannot be created if all commodities are sold either above or below their values. In other words, there's this sort of a linear optimality that's sort of assumed, because gains are canceled by losses. In other words, if you always have some kind of variance that is operating here, that it always optimizes or levels out, and you can't get any surplus value because nothing's getting saved, as it were. And I use the word saved here because that's problematic, but it is a kind of accumulation, and that's the business between the difference, in fact, between primitive accumulation and capitalist accumulation, or capital accumulation. He further argues that no other distinction than that between buyers and sellers can be conceptualized on the basis of simple circulation alone. To introduce other distinctions is to introduce new considerations. So you can see here that Marx is, as I just suggested, with the idea that exchange is not just one single moment of exchange. It is a system of, whole process of, pattern of exchanges. Finally, Marx argues that even if some buyers can manage to buy cheap, and or some sellers sell dear, that is merchants, for whatever reason, no surplus value is created for one's gain as another's loss. That just evens out, and that's kind of, everyone thinks the free market operates this way, but that would be false, of course, because you do want to have a free market and make a profit. Thus, only the distribution of value is affected, not the total value. Now, here this idea of the scale again, that you have all these value transactions at one level, but what Marx is interested in, as I just suggested, is this large scalar kind of thing. It needs to be bigger, and when it's bigger, you get these kind of things that can include surplus. The conclusion is that, leaving aside this case, that is merchants and users' capital, that would be considered later. And note that he's just setting these aside. He's going to bring all these things back in, in subsequent volumes. Surplus value can be created neither within nor outside circulation. So it's not necessarily within circulation, and it's not outside circulation. it's sort of a contradiction. It's a problematic contradiction in the general formula for capital, and it gets resolved in chapter 6, the next chapter. Now I'm going to yak here, I think, chapter 6 and then stop. But I hope you're still with me here. The idea is that he's building this little model of things that get exchanged, and it kind of depends on being dynamic, that is constantly moving around, and that it also gets bigger. It's growing in that sense. And so capitalism requires these kinds of things. It's always has this dynamic element, and that it can veer towards growth of some kind. Noting, of course, that Marx's whole issue is that at some moment it screws up and creates crisis, which a lot of people just don't want to say that this is part of the system, or they want to assume that the kind of chaos is only a short-term problem and not totally cataclysmic. And I hope that you can see that is relative to the Great Recession, the Great Depression, all of these kind of market panics and all these other things, that's not quite so. The solution to the contradiction is found in identifying a commodity which, when purchased, can be used to create more value than it has itself. Such a commodity is labor power. Now, you could do this with other things, but labor power is the example because it's easy to explain to workers because of the question of how much time you spend making stuff or doing stuff, and noting that the capitalist is going to skim stuff off, whether it's time or work or some other kind of energy, whatever. So you got to sort of get a sense of how this contradiction occurs, and that it is a commodity as well. And it's measured at another level by wages. For example, the issue of the $15 an hour is a good idea, but if you're never getting more than 29 hours a week, it really makes little sense relative to the original version of what counts as the minimum wage. Labor power is the aggregate of those mental and physical capabilities existing in the physical form, the living personality of a human being, capabilities which he sets in motion whenever he produces a use value of any kind. For labor power to be a commodity, certain preconditions are required. Now, in this entire model, there's all these things he's building up in capital. The fact that, you have this process, but it has lots of other contingencies built into it. The laborer must be a free individual, owner of his own labor power. That is, if you're engaging in one thing, you can't have another job on the side that sort of interferes with your ability to do that. You're not totally free in that sense. Don't totally own your own labor power if you have like two jobs and one job collides with the other one in terms of scheduling. Selling it for a limited period, i.e. not a slave or a serf, so it has a certain limit. And secondly, the laborer must be able to produce commodities or subsist on the basis of his own labor. He must be free in the double sense of being a free commodity owner and being free of all the objects necessary for the realization of his labor power. So it is this interesting idea. Just as the commodity and money, so also capital is an economic category, does not have a natural origin. There isn't a kind of, natural economy out there, although you can argue for that, but let's not get into too much, Animal Planet stuff. Does not have a natural origin, but rests on the development of particular social relations. Thus, again, behind the level of economic appearances, Marx finds definite social relations on which the economic categories rest. The value of labor power is determined by the labor time necessary for production and consequently also the reproduction of this specific article. The value of labor power is the value of the means of subsistence necessary for the maintenance of its owner. So this is, do you really work yours to the bone? This is the quantity of means necessary to maintain him in his normal state as a working individual. It includes a moral and historical element, an allowance for the production of a new generation, and the education and training of the workers. So, a pretty complete culture in that particular sense for production and reproduction. Marx's definition of the value of labor power is not always consistent and has been the subject of some debate. And this is continuously an issue, and it is why there is a problem, because of that distinction between labor as the actual mechanics of your picking up something and sticking the square peg in the round hole, and the fact that it's part of a larger system where you're getting some time shaved off or some value shaved off because of the way the work is organized or the way the relationships are organized. The value of labor power depends, therefore, on the quantity of means of subsistence required and on the value of those means of subsistence. Labor power is quite distinct from labor, which is what I just said. Labor power, the commodity sold by the worker, is only the capacity to labor. Now, this capacity to labor can be defined in a variety of ways. It can be defined as expectation. It can be made, it has a bunch of other contingencies that are possible. Thus, when the buyer purchases labor power, he does not, unlike other commodities, have in his hands the use value of the commodity. It's still kind of ephemeral. He still has to realize the labor power by setting the worker to work in the sphere of production. So it's all about the relationships, that is, scheduling in that, or programming in that particular sense. And thus, the examination of labor power takes us beyond circulation to the quote-unquote hidden abode of production, where surplus value is created as the labor is set to labor. So as I've tried to express here, remember that Marx's whole argument here is about, it's about the working class. It's about, it's about a class distinction that most people, kind of work with their hands, they're, et cetera. They have certain kind of attributes, and it's easy to relate to and easy to organize in terms of sort of, a kind of political movement or social movement, that people can relate to this really easy in this particular way. You work for a wage, that you're getting ripped off. There's nothing you can do about it, and you try and do other things like, not work as hard, cut corners, or sign up for extra shifts, that all of these things are possible. So let me finish with the comments and then we can stop. In the chapters, that is the first 6 chapters, the procedure adopted by Marx in chapter 1 is repeated. This is what Higginbottom keeps saying, that, just annoyed that Marx repeats himself a lot. He starts from the level of economic appearances, from the formal analysis of the circulation of commodities, of money, and of capital. So your circulation of commodities, circulation of money, circulation of capital. Just as Marx found behind the circulation of commodities a particular kind of social relationship, that between independent producers participating in the division of labor, so he finds behind the circulation of money a developed form of the division of labor, and behind the circulation of capital, a new social relationship, that between the capitalist and the free wage laborer. So that's the point he's making, is that, there's a system, a set of relations, and you have actually classes of people, a new social relationship. Some guys own the equipment, you don't get to own the equipment. Or, there's intermediate hybridized forms, you own your tools, and et cetera, et cetera. Thus, again, Marx starts off with a purely economic analysis by looking behind, this is that other problem again, by looking behind the economic categories, Marx finds that these are in fact, this is where the Hegel comes in, the economic forms of appearance of particular social relationships, forms of appearance that hide as much as they reveal. This is this veil, often referred to in a slightly different version as a money veil. Thus, it is only analysis that shows us behind the commodity, the labor of interdependent producers, behind money, the social character of labor, and behind capital, the relationship between capitalist and wage laborer. To remain at the level of these economic appearances, to study the economy as a self-sufficient sphere, is to ignore the social foundation of the economy, and so to take the social relations on which it rests for granted, to treat them as though they were natural rather than social and historical phenomena. In other words, it's not always that way, and stuff happens. Just as in chapter 1, the analytical argument depends on a number of assumptions, preconditions, that maybe seem arbitrary at first. The assumption that commodities exchange at their value or that surplus value cannot derive from an unequal exchange. This is, an interesting question, and a lot of ink gets spilled on this. But again, the rationale of these assumptions is to be found in the nature of the abstraction Marx is engaged in. Thus, he assumes that commodities exchange at their value because he is concentrating on one social relationship only, that between commodity owners. This is the simple model. That is, the commodities that are being owned is, labor power, money, certain things, and it's very simple. It's a simple set of relations. He assumes the surplus value cannot derive from unequal exchange. That is, because this form of surplus value represents a transfer from one section of the dominant class to another. That is, from feudal landowners to merchants or users, from one sort of capitalist to another, whereas Marx is concentrating, for now, that this is the front end of the argument, on the relationship between the capitalist and the worker alone. And in this relationship, there is no reason why the capitalist should be able to buy labor power from the worker below its value or sell means of subsistence to the worker above their value. Competition between capitalists normally prevents this happening. So this is the kind of Smithian assumption that, that it kind of clears, it kind of works itself out. There's a kind of equilibrium. That's the first time I use the word equilibrium. The other forms of surplus value, that is merchant or user's capital, are derivative in the sense that they involve a redistribution of surplus value that is already produced. That's the analysis must first focus on the production of surplus value that is found in the relation between capitalist and wage laborer. Now, this may seem very subtle, but producing surplus value is a combination of things, and it's problematic because sometimes it's just not there. It only is there because of all these other contingencies. It's a very dynamic element. So often you couldn't measure it because, well, it sort of clears at some point, simply because of the way, the activity or the market operates. So I'll stop there. We're only in chapter 7. We're going to move further for this section, up through 1. We've got a lot more chapters to read, and I hope you will read them. This is not a very long piece here, and if you can sort of work through this outline better, I think the actual reading will be easier when you have to read this. And yes, Simon Clarke says you can skip this chapter, which considers a series of examples in which Marx explores the relationship between variations of the length of working day, intensity of labor, and productivity of labor on the one hand, and the rate of surplus value on the other. And that just gets, you get bogged down in this, but, he's trying to work through this. And the reason why he's doing this, and it seems redundant, and that's what Marx does, is to make this clear for a lot of people who have to organize, if you have to organize workers, you got to be able to explain to them, why does this happen? And it's not simply the length of the working day, it's about productivity and the other stuff that gets skimmed off. That is, they force you to work longer, they try and get more productivity, they give you time and a half and not double time, all that stuff. So there are all these little details about, productivity and stuff, which seems very general and vague, but in fact, it's measurable. And that's what Marx is trying to work through, the difference between the qualitative and the quantitative, and the fact that you need both of them to sort of work through this to get to accumulation of capital, et cetera. You can see here that I need to speed up on doing this to get to the end. At the end here, this is the end of volume 1. I included an example today, or that talks about, and this is a much more advanced version of it, but the fact is, Wall Street types and venture capitalists are now going back, whatever, to supporting Trump because they sort of acknowledge that, regulations cut into the costs and cut into the accumulation of surplus value. So do taxes. And so at a global level, you need to work through not simply regulations, but there's a whole system of fees and other things that are part of the problem that drive up the issues, and because other people are trying to skim their own surplus value of the system. So you can just say that, and this little piece here argues in a very different way. It's this that Jamil Bowie is trying to tell people that, the Democrats actually have a better way of doing this. And at its basis, it's kind of a neoliberal argument, but it's still, the Democrats are actually really kind of important to this process. And there's this little suggestion here that being Democratic can also lead to both either socialism or authoritarianism. And lest you think that's unimportant, we have certain kinds of issues that are coming up. And I posted something recently. The Project 2025 proposes that we bring back the military draft conscription for the United States. Now, this is problematic for X number of reasons, because I don't think they mention in this little thing that the right wingers are proposing is that women are included in this draft. I think it is actually a very male draft, or continues to be a male draft. And so that has its own kind of element, and actually is an issue that one can organize on. Okay, I've yammered enough. You can talk. See, I can just crank this out for an hour and
It's time to get your tin hats and flak jackets on, Anley.
Indeed.
Pick up the rifle.
Hey, that's one way of getting revolution, but you got to make sure you have enough people. And that's the problem with the right wing. They think that having their little assault rifle is going to, all these little armed militias are, none of them have major weapons. They're just
Well,
going to
they won't need much training if they're going to be conscripted anyway,
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
They might be able to teach the army a few things.
Well, the fact of the matter is that we've had a volunteer force for so long that people have forgotten what the problems were with conscription in the American context. In Ukraine and Russia, there's mobilization, and you're just press ganged into this. You have no choice. If you're a Ukrainian between the ages of 18 and 60, there's a possibility that they just grab you. And in certain cases, they have been just grabbing people. But it's a full mobilization because, the country's been invaded. The Russians are a little bit different, but they do their conscription totally differently. And everybody's supposed to spend a year in the army. And, of course, people get out of it. They flee the country or whatever. So there's all these other issues.
Bill Rich Daddy.
Well, exactly. There's a specific battalion or brigade or division that the Russians, the rich Russians, get to put their kids in, because so they won't experience too much combat.
Yes.
And undoubtedly, it operates by bribery.
They do all the thinking back home. They don't leave the front line.
I mean, you can see that there are class distinctions. I mean, this whole question of drone warfare is about people who, you've got to have good skills to operate drones, right? You have to have, gamer skills.
Yeah, that's not massively. Well, actually, you won't need any skills soon because they're going they're going totally autonomous. So,
Well, yes, that's true too. That's true too. We're not at the state yet where, you know, they can be more autonomous, but at some moment they will be, and they'll just, you know, kill things because they don't look, you know, you're not the right shape or whatever. They'll just blow you away.
mhm. Yes.
Anyone else?
Yeah, just a comment. I thought, I think it was Sunday's reading. Higginbotham did, to me, it seemed like a good sort of an overview in a short period of time of the various volumes, you know, the 3 volumes. And
Yes.
it seemed like it kind of dovetailed nice with this content too, you know?
Yes. Well, it does. Ultimately, everyone who does their little version of this tries to make it work. And I like Higginbottom only because he tries to show that it's not just divided up. They're not discrete volumes, but there is some connection among the volumes, and the literature, the latest literature in the 21st century points to the connection between all 3 volumes, among all 3 volumes.
Yeah, and it's neat as he keeps coming back to his illustration, you know, that shows the 3 layers there, you know.
Oh yeah, yeah. But each layer is really complicated. That's what, you know, people get confused. You know, you have to sort of assume that, you know, there's this whole surface of things that you got to think about that are not hard. You just have to assume that there's these, as I refer to them, nested elements that are there. That, and you have to worry about sometimes what you call these things that are connected.
Yeah, there's the complexity of the layers, but I think there's also something else going on too, because it's like you're, you know, coming to understanding this and in a, you know, sort of a rational way, but then part of you has this like, you know, irrational reaction, like, hey, they're fucking with me, like, you know.
Well,
And
yes. I
those
mean,
two
that's
things happen at the same time, right?
yes, they do. They convince us that, well, the system operates like this. It's how, you know, the capitalists operate. But at some moment, it screws up, and you know, it's nothing that you can always identify. But at some moment, there's chaos comes, and it doesn't really occur always at a regular kind of you know, schedule or whatever.
Yeah.
I mean, it occurs because, you know, well, they decided to have some sort of quasi slave operation, and that fucks things up. You know, I would say that Jim Crow, you know, the fact that what you wanted to do in Reconstruction gets fucked up around 1877, and everything else is, you know, more racism and bullshit and stupidity. And America would have been a lot different had we been able to actually, well, I would think that if Reconstruction really operated after 1877, I think the country would be very different now. But it didn't,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
that's where we are.
Yeah.
I mean, and it's more complicated than that. It's not simply about African Americans and migration within the country, et cetera. It's international or transatlantic migration because of, you know, potatoes and revolution, or as in my case, you know, there's an exclusionary law put in to limit, you know, people coming into the country. Only males, for example, only Asian males could be allowed into the country in whatever it is, 1889 or whatever. And of course that gets kind of altered in a variety of ways by the time we get to the turn of the century. But it so many of these things have these kind of constraints in it. So, for example, if the American conscription system comes back, that is a draft of some kind, the problem of draft, of course, is simply about, originally it's designed by, it has categories and age and other conditionals built into it that I'm not, what is that draft system going to look like? And will it include women? Or will there be a deferment system so people will, bribe their way out of this? There's all these things. And of course, if we really are being liberal about it, I suppose, you should be able to have a Peace Corps, AmeriCorps option, but the Republicans won't go for that. That's a welfare system, right?
All right. Yeah.
I think the simple solution is if you're enlisted, if you're a student at a Christian university, you shouldn't have to serve.
Well, that's what the Israelis are trying to do.
Yes,
the right,
exactly.
Yeah.
Yep.
exactly the same thing.
You can use that same thing. If you're in the seminary, you shouldn't have to go to the draft.
Closer you are to Christian nationalism, the closer you are to, whatever, God.
I need to take a closer look at these liberty universities, huh?
Oh, man.
You need to take a closer look at religion in general and its tax-free status.
Indeed.
Well, yeah, the draft worked out so well last time.
Oh, God.
I mean, you got to just, if anybody wants to see how well the draft worked out, watch Apocalypse Now.
Indeed. Well, the draft really
Who's
was.
your commanding officer? Ain't you?
Well, the whole system is just so screwed. I mean, it's just amazing how war even got waged. But
So do you think Rishi Sunak got a sniff of the GOP's plans?
well, I
Because
think the
he's
more
pushing
people,
it.
the more people see the actual Project 2025,
Mm.
the more you're going to see it's fascism. It's like, well, we can't have that. We can't have that. And then if you have pre-existing that, well, I guess we'll lock them up or throw them out of the country, right? Or whatever.
Yeah, I wish CNN would do like a 10-part series on Project 2025 and just fucking, deep fucking dive into all the details. Because I don't think 90% of America even knows it exists.
Mm.
Yeah. The current polling shows that nobody knows about
Nobody
it.
knows.
That this needs free speech TV needs to do a whole thing about it.
Yeah.
I mean, you'd have a program. That's fine.
Yeah, I mean, Chris Hayes should do a 2-hour special on just that. In fact, I will send him an email.
Take a look at some of the Supreme Court justices too.
Oh, Jesus. Well,
that's a whole other one.
The latest reveal of this woman who, I guess she poses. I mean, it cost her $500 to join the society.
Yeah, I heard that.
History of the Supreme Court or whatever it is, but she did. I wonder what a rig is. Where does she put the microphone? And what she interviews or talks to, Alito's wife, who is like a nutball. I mean, you really see how crazy. And Alito is just sort of, your standard conservative Catholic, but his wife, I mean, she just.
I would like to hear. I didn't hear that. I heard him bringing the undercover, but I didn't hear her.
Oh no, there's some. I think you can get it on Twitter. They have little segments of.
Midas Touch will probably show it at some point.
The Majority Report did a bit.
Vergonia.
Yeah, I made a Vergonia. Look at watch. Look in the chat. Look in the chat.
Great. Okay. I'll look
in the chat.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Joe, you can cut it. Thank you very much. Thank you for your attention. Tomorrow I'll try and do it faster. We'll try and see if we can get closer to the end of volume 1. I will probably try to be more economical with my discussion.